From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Rishad Salamat in Hong Kong on the continuing spread of the coronavirus across the globe. And Drew Armstrong right here in New York on what the United States is going to do to try to contain the virus right here. So, Rishad, let's go to you. Thank you so much for your continued reporting over there. Explain to us where we are on the spread of the coronavirus. As far as we know, President Trump says he thinks we're getting under control.
Well, absolutely. He said that the other day. And also Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, said also that they had the capacity now to limit what's going on, and that was working. Mr. Trump will be addressing the nation and the world in about 6 hours' time from now to give an idea of to what they might be doing next to prevent an expansion of this here as well. Don't forget, our House Minority Leader Chuck Schumer also trying to finalize plans for an $8.5 billion program here, according to reports that Bloomberg has actually seen here as well. But nonetheless, we have a virus which continues to spread. In Iran, we've got 19 deaths. We've got the first one in Latin America, first case, I should say, in Brazil. On top of that, Greece, and let's not forget also the Middle East, Bahrain and Kuwait, also adding to the numbers that we have already. And other countries are preparing. The European Union, for one thing, the disease control of the European Commission also battening down the hatches now as well, as over in Italy we see the death toll mount and also the number of cases also multiplied there as well. In Britain we have an isolation facility being set up at London's Heathrow Airport. This against this backdrop of a overseas expansion. When I say overseas, I mean outside of China. In China itself, actually, percentage-wise, the spread seems to be getting a bit slow. Hubei province, of course, is an anomaly. We've got 401 new cases in the last 24 hours there, as opposed to 401 overall for China. So actually, it's 401 in Hubei province here as well. So that's where we are, David. And, you know, there are economic consequences, naturally.
Well, exactly. Let's talk about those economic consequences. I mean, we always want to remember that at its base, this is a human tragedy, but it has economic and business consequences. And I suppose they may come in two different forms. One is the shutting down of factories, for example, in Hubei province, but also there's the secondary knock-on effect of the effect on consumer confidence, willingness to go out and spend money.
Well, that's it, isn't it? And we were talking yesterday about how you could perhaps cut interest rates by 25 basis points. But what difference would it make when families are so concerned about their loved ones' health and don't want to go out onto the streets? Taking a look at Hong Kong here, we had the budget today, and every Hong Kong permanent resident, that doesn't include me, will be getting $1,284 as sort of helicopter money here as well. But, you know, belying that sort of joviality, it is a very serious problem. Vietnam, at the moment, virtually halving its growth projections for this year, looking at, 6.3% growth. They were looking at 10.5% growth before here as well. Cathay Pacific, based here in Hong Kong, 25,000 staff being asked to take unpaid leave for 3 weeks. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. We've got over 100 aircraft that have been parked on the side of Chek Lap Kok Airport, which is over there. Just really, David, I want to end on something. We've talked a lot at this time about how the suppression of information made things worse. I want to go back to 102 years ago to the Spanish flu, which ultimately led to something like the death of about 50 million people. And I'm not saying this is anything on that scale, but part of that was blamed on wartime censorship, so people couldn't actually get information as to what was going on. Let's hope that history doesn't repeat itself.
Yes, I should certainly hope. By the way, I wasn't even around for the Spanish flu, as I recall, 102 years ago. Thank you so much for that great reporting from Rishad Salamat over in Hong Kong. And now let's come back here to New York and Drew Armstrong to really cover about what the United States is doing or can be doing to try to at least deter the virus here, because we have, as Rishad said, we have the president addressing us at 6 o'clock this evening, Eastern time.
Yeah, I think there's two key things to keep in mind here right now. You know, on one hand, we only have about a dozen cases that have been diagnosed in the United States, most of those in travelers from China, and the flow of travel from China has been greatly reduced. On the other hand, you have top officials at the CDC warning that, hey, this is coming here. We are going to see more cases. We need to be ready for this and to see a situation like we have beginning to emerge in Europe, in the United States, and giving some potentially very dire sounding outlooks about how that would look like what that would look like in the U.S. in terms of the response here. So there's really two sets of ideas that I think people need to be able to combine. The idea that, hey, so far this may not be here, but if you look at how this is beginning to slowly spread around the world, or at least emerge around the world, that probably does happen here in the United States.
Are we confident that we know the way it's transmitted? Because that seems to be a key element in figuring out how to stop it, or at least deter it if we can't altogether stop it.
I think from what we know right now, that this is like any other respiratory disease, and that the steps you would take to not get the flu or a cold, if you're living in New York City, are exactly the same ones that you would take to not get coronavirus. That means washing your hands, using hand sanitizer, covering your mouth when you cough, not, holding onto a subway pole and then rubbing your eye. I mean, all those things that we hopefully practice in cold and flu season, same playbook right here.
Very fascinating. Okay, thanks so much to Drew Armstrong for that report on the U.S. efforts to deter the coronavirus. We're going to bring you President Trump's news conference on the coronavirus at 6 p.m. Eastern time this evening. And now let's find out what's going on with the markets and how they may be reacting to some of the developments. And actually, as I look at equity markets, we have an uptick today.
Well, we have an uptick, but we actually have a bearish development over just the last, let's call it 15 to 20 minutes, because at the highs, the S&P 500, talk about a strong rebound rally from the 4-day sell-off, had been up 1.7%. Now the S&P 500 is up just 0.5%. And even when each of the major indices was up more than 1%, there were cracks in today's rebound rally. Oil is lower, bonds are higher, the Dow Transport's up just modestly. And at this point, the Dow Transport's actually down about 1%. So it seems like the bulls who wanted to buy in, the buy the dip mentality that we've had over the last couple of years, not working right now. Those coronavirus fears coming back into the picture. And worrisome is the fact that the Dow Transport's absolutely sliced below that 200-day moving average, well below it. In the past, without exception, that has meant the S&P 500 will go down to at least its 200-day moving average, which means more work to the downside, perhaps.
So, Abigail, as you follow these markets, because you do it very closely, is it basically at this moment just keying off of whatever we get, good, bad, or indifferent about the coronavirus? For example, as we look forward to 6 o'clock this evening, Eastern time, will the markets be really looking for what President Trump has to say with his CDC officials? Oh,
absolutely. I have to believe that's the case. And the futures markets will be open at that time, so it's possible to track what the live reaction is to what President Trump does say and what sort of strategy could be outlined at that time. At this point, though, in terms of the markets themselves, there's so much technical buying and selling going on, more so selling. So it's these key technical levels and these moving averages that traders and investors want to pay attention to. Algos seem to be very much programmed into that 200-day moving average on a number of the different indices. Even in Europe, the stock 600 went below its 200-day moving average. All of this does suggest, especially when you put it together with the commodity complex, because the commodity complex on the year down about 9%, the S&P 500 down just about 2%. When you have a divergence of that sort between various risk assets, it tends to suggest a disagreement, more volatility ahead. Right now, we had been in that period, David, last year of that melt up of small moves. Now we're back into a period of big moves, and right now they seem to be more to the downside.
Fascinating, really helpful. Thank you very much, Abigail Doolittle, for that report on the markets. And now we turn to Mark Crumpton because he's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. The coronavirus continues to spread. Brazil has confirmed its first case. Officials say a 61-year-old Brazilian who recently traveled to Italy for work tested positive for the illness, while dozens have been tested from Mexico to Brazil with similar symptoms. This marks the first confirmed case in Latin America. President Trump will hold a news conference at 6 p.m. New York time to discuss the outbreak. You can watch it here on Bloomberg Television. Hong Kong is trying to cushion the economic blow from the coronavirus and political unrest. The government unveiled a budget that's packed with giveaways. One of them, a one-time cash payment of almost $1,300 for every adult permanent resident. Economists are forecasting Hong Kong's economy will shrink for a second year in a row. Turkey is signaling it may try to challenge Russian control of Syrian airspace. The Turkish President Recep Erdogan said today he's looking for ways to strike attacking Syrian government forces from their own skies. Turkey has raised about 10,000 troops in Idlib in its biggest move to counter the Syrian government offensive in the 9-year civil war. In the UK, opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn accused Boris Johnson of being a part-time prime minister. Johnson failed to visit flood-stricken parts of the UK last week. Instead, he stayed at a government-owned country mansion. Johnson also was criticized by members of his own Conservative Party. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, Palmetto State Firewall. The former Vice President Joe Biden picks up a key endorsement in South Carolina. But will it be enough? We head to Charleston next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. The Democratic candidates ripped into each other last night ahead of this Saturday's primary in South Carolina, and most of those attacks were aimed at frontrunner Bernie Sanders.
Not only is this a way to get Donald Trump reelected, we got a House to worry about. We got a Senate to worry about.
I like Bernie. We came in together to the Senate, but I do not think that this is the best person to lead the ticket.
I dug in, I did the work, and then Bernie's team trashed me for it.
Bernie, in fact, hasn't passed much of anything. The fact of the matter is that
Donald Trump thinks it would be better if he's president. I do not think so. Vladimir Putin thinks that Donald Trump should be president of the United States, and that's why Russia is helping you get elected, so you'll lose to him.
For more on the big takeaways from the debate last night, let's go now to Charleston, South Carolina, where Bloomberg chief Washington correspondent Kevin Cirilli is standing by as he's been for some time now. So, Kevin, give us your take on that debate last night.
For former Vice President Joe Biden, they're hoping that this is going to be a launch pad into the South Carolina primary this weekend, where he's still leading the pack amongst the Democratic presidential candidates, David. They're then hoping that that momentum will fuel them into Super Tuesday, 1 week from today. In talking with several of the top advisors to the Biden campaign, they feel incredibly confident at his performance last night. Beyond that, Senator Bernie Sanders also saying that if he's not able to get the 1,991 delegates that are needed to technically clinch the nomination, that he would get a plurality of those delegates, and that will allow him to say that he is, in fact, the Democratic nominee. From there, however, the whispers in the spin room, not really whispers, but the chatter in the spin room last night, David, this is the last point I'll make, is that expect people to drop out sometime after Super Tuesday next week. And that would mean that in the next round of contests in the weeks to come, this field will be very much more narrow, and the contrast will only grow sharper. David?
Okay, thanks so very much to Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent Kevin Cirilli, who's done a terrific job down there in South Carolina covering that debate. And for their analysis of what we saw last night, we welcome now Bloomberg contributor Jeannie Zaino. She's political science professor at Iona College here in New York. And in Washington, Lanny Chen. He's a fellow at the Hoover Institution. So, Jeannie, I'll start with you and ask you basically what's going to make a difference in this primary. And let me start with one thing. We have Congressman Clyburn earlier today, coming out and endorsing the former Vice President Biden. This is what he had to say.
I've known for a long time who I'm going to vote for. But I had not decided whether or not to share it with the public. But I want the public to know that I'm voting for Joe Biden. I know Joe. We know Joe. But most importantly, Joe knows us.
So, Jeannie, we know Jim Clyburn traditionally has been a very influential figure in the Democratic Party in South Carolina. Do endorsements mean this year what they have meant in past years?
I think that's the big question. You know, he is so incredibly well respected. He's got such an important voice in the state. And yet we've seen these type of typical endorsements from more establishment figures like Clyburn, who has a really powerful position in the House and is close to Nancy Pelosi, may not carry the weight that they used to, particularly with the base that's supporting Bernie Sanders and particularly with young people. So I think it's a question, although, you know, for Joe Biden, I think this is an important moment and it should matter, but I don't know if we're going to see that because, as we were just discussing in Nevada, though the lack of an endorsement by the Culinary Union did not do much. The Latinos still went out, members of the union still went out and supported Bernie Sanders despite their criticism of him.
So Lanny, one of the things I'm grasping for, at least after the debate last night, is what is going to make a difference? Maybe endorsements, maybe not endorsements. Will issues make a difference? Because last night there were some issues mentioned along the way, but that didn't seem to me to be a debate fundamentally about issues.
No, it wasn't. It was not a debate fundamentally about issues. I do think this contrast on Medicare for all that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have embraced, and then the more so-called moderate options proposed by Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden and others, I do think that dividing line is going to be important as we move ahead in this campaign. But I do think what it's coming down to, I think what Democratic voters are looking at, as far as I can tell, is who's got that fire in the belly to go up against Donald Trump? Who is going to be a candidate who can present and prosecute a case against Trump? Not so much the substance of that case, really kind of who's got the wherewithal to take him on. And so that's why I think you saw Joe Biden get a little bit more aggressive last night. I thought it was his best debate of the season so far. And so I think it's going to be those personality elements or those elements of the style with which these candidates take on Donald Trump that's going to be more significant in this campaign.
So, Jeannie, I find that fascinating, and it goes maybe to the electability that we've talked about before. Is it turning into who can be as Trump is? That is to say, as fiery and as explosive. And Elizabeth Warren was combative last night.
Yeah, she was combative. Pete Buttigieg is a very good debater. I agree with Lonnie that Joe Biden had his best performance in a debate. And it is the one thing that unifies all Democrats, right, is who can beat Donald Trump. And yet it is striking to me that again last night, just like in the debate in Nevada, very little was taken to Donald Trump. They were fighting each other in this sort of circular firing squad, yet very little fire was turned on Donald Trump. So in my mind and in the mind of some other people, Donald Trump came out a real winner of this debate last night. Democrats are going to have to take it to Donald Trump. Maybe they're going to do that after Super Tuesday when this field winnows. But this thing is going to get very tight with Donald Trump very quick if they don't winnow this field fast and look at Donald Trump and start to take him on some of these issues.
Lonnie, what about it? Did Donald Trump win the debate last night?
Yeah, I mean, anytime Democrats are focusing their fire on one another and not on him, I think it's a benefit. But more broadly, I think the reason why the Trump team has to be feeling very good about where they're positioned is because of Bernie Sanders' continued success. I mean, it's remarkable, David. You've got a candidate who's the leading candidate for the Democratic Party, who's essentially embraced Cuba and the history, the repressive history of the Cuban regime. And that doesn't even seem to really trigger a response amongst the electorate. And I mean, I guess we'll see over these next couple of weeks if it does. But so far, at least, it's not really seemingly been a factor. And so I think for the Trump team, they're looking at this gleefully. I think they like the fact that candidates are attacking one another. Having been involved in a number of these competitive primaries, I can just say it's not always necessarily a bad thing when candidates are trying to make each other better. There isn't always necessarily a bad thing to candidates attacking each other. You see what happens in uncompetitive situations. People come out unprepared. So there is a potentially silver lining to this yelling we saw last night.
So, Jeannie, I think it's received wisdom. Typically, we don't elect presidents according to foreign affairs. It's domestic issues. At the same time, pick up on what Lonnie said, because it wasn't just that Bernie Sanders is saying, yeah, there's some good things about Castro. There are some good things about Russia, things like that. But he also last night took on the United States and said, we've had terrible foreign policy with respect to overthrowing the Shah of Iran and overthrowing the regime in Guatemala back in the 50s and things. Is that really going to work on the Democratic side these days?
You know, I don't think it's going to work in those states that Democrats need to win, in these swing states where they need to win this election. I don't think it is going to be a selling point to have Bernie Sanders out there in Florida, for instance, talking about the benefits of reading and literacy in Cuba under Fidel Castro, without, at the very least, taking on the evil aspects of that regime, of which there are many. So I do think this is a problem for Democrats. I agree with you. Foreign policy seldom elects presidents unless we're in a crisis time. But this is, you know, I think a little bit broader than just a foreign policy issue. This is who Bernie Sanders is and has been. And as the American public gets more and more introduced to him, I think it's going to be hard to sell in places like Virginia, South Carolina, Florida, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere.
Okay, thank you so much to our panel of Jeannie Zaino here in New York and Lonnie Chen in Washington. Always good to have you with us. And don't forget to tune in to our special coverage of Super Tuesday. We're going to have the analysis of the Democratic contest March 3rd. That's going to be starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Still ahead here, Disney's new CEO and his first big challenge, perhaps. It may just be the coronavirus. It's our stock of the hour. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Time now for the stock of the hour. Disney shares are in the red after the company named Bob Chapek as the new CEO, ending years of speculation over who would come after Bob Iger. Both men spoke to Bloomberg about Chapek's strategy after the announcement yesterday.
I intend to double down on the exact same strategies that Bob has established 15 years ago that have served us so well. The thing I've really taken away from Bob Iger's legacy is get the content right and everything else kind of follows suit.
We welcome now Abigail Doolittle for what the move may mean for shareholders of the Walt Disney Company. So what does it mean? As I say, they're down right now.
They are down right now. You know what's so interesting about what Bob Chapek was just saying? He's planning on doubling down on Bob Iger's strategy. So everybody has known that Bob Iger at some point would step down as CEO. But I think a lot of people are caught off sides by the fact that it was so sudden, so abrupt. Why is that? The last quarter relative to streaming was very good. Of course, streaming just happened. So that's something to ponder. And I think that is one reason why the stock is down, wondering why that's the case. The second is why Bob Chapek? Because some thought that Kevin Mayer, the head of streaming, could get it. But you could make the case, and you would know more about this than me in a lot of ways, that Bob Chapek, a 27-year veteran, he will be just the 7th CEO at Disney. So loyalty, clearly a big deal there. That could be a big piece. But also, he started off with DVDs back in the day. He then went to retail. Now he is the head of parks, or was the head of parks. That's their biggest revenue segment. So that may actually really be the reason.
Yeah, I mean, I know Kevin Mayer. I've worked closely with him. He's a very, very smart deal maker and has really been the architect of a lot of the deals with Bob Iger that Bob Iger has done. At the same time, Bob Chapek really knows distribution and marketing and things like that. It may say something about where they think the company goes next. Do they need more big deals, or do they need to really execute on the deals that Iger's already done?
That's a great point, David, because of course the biggest deal that was just done, Fox, and then over the last 15 years, Pixar and Lucasfilms and some of these other ones. So they really do have that legacy content in place to some extent. So in terms of, to your point, that Bob Chapek, more of somebody who can get things done on a day-to-day basis, especially around these parks, because let's face it, right now with this coronavirus, I was just looking at a chart. I'm stunned. This stock is almost in a bear market from its all-time high. Much of that coming just in the last week on the coronavirus fears.
Well, and they've got Shanghai, of course. They've got Hong Kong as well.
Yes.
We don't want to forget about that either. And in the meantime, they also have substantial cruise lines, Disney does.
That is an amazing point that you make there, because all of the turmoil that we have seen around the coronavirus tragedy and cruise lines, when you think about Disney, I first think about those parks. So as you mentioned, they've closed those Asian ones. We now have the CDC saying it's when, not if. That could affect operations here. But to your point, these cruise lines, who wants to get on a cruise line right now? So they've invested a lot of money there. Again, parks, I believe cruise lines, I'm not 100% on this, is included in that 37% segment. That could be a real hit. That could be a real problem.
It seems like they got great assets, and they'll come through this at some point. Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. Up next, the United States prepares for a possible coronavirus pandemic. We speak with a doctor who's been studying coronaviruses for nearly 4 decades. That's coming up. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, Joe Biden's struggling presidential campaign got a boost today. He claimed one of South Carolina's most coveted endorsements. Congressman Jim Clyburn, the highest-ranking black member of Congress, threw his support behind the former vice president. The move comes 3 days before South Carolina's primary and 6 days before Super Tuesday. The Pentagon says it needs at least $167 billion over the next 5 years to strengthen and modernize the U.S. nuclear weapons program. The proposal includes $29 billion for next year, increased gradually to $38 billion in 2025. The plan reflects a major boost to an effort started under former President Obama to replace aging nuclear systems. The violence in India has claimed more lives. Officials now say at least 24 people were killed, nearly 200 others injured in 3 days of clashes in New Delhi. Protesters were demonstrating against India's new religion-based citizenship law. The clashes were the worst communal riots in the Indian capital in decades. A $13.5 billion settlement between victims of California's wildfires and PG&E, the utility blamed for causing them, was supposed to bring some peace to the victims. Instead, many say they are being forced to fight for their piece of the pie. More than 81,000 people have filed claims, and individual homeowners worry they will be pushed to the back of the list. They're also unhappy that half the settlement will be paid in PG&E stock instead of cash. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
And we have some breaking news right now. A red headline crossing the Bloomberg. The Trump administration reportedly has decided to pare exemptions for oil refineries from U.S. requirements to use biofuels. This comes in response to a federal court ruling earlier last month. That's according to two people familiar with the matter. As we know, this has been an issue of some controversy, with particularly the farm lobby in the White House saying we really should cut back on these exemptions, have higher requirements to use biofuels, things like ethanol. And reportedly now, the Trump administration, in fact, will go along with that and cut back on the exemptions for biofuels. Now I want to return to the coronavirus. It has continued to spread, with the first confirmed case in Latin America, down in Brazil. And President Trump is scheduled to speak at 6 p.m. Eastern Time today about U.S. efforts to control the epidemic. We welcome now Dr. Samuel Perlman. He's professor in departments of microbiology and immunology and also of pediatrics at the University of Iowa. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being with us. Start with the most basic things. How can one contract this virus as far as we know?
As far as we know, most people will contract it via respiratory route. They will get it on their hands and then convey it to their face, to their mouth or their nose. They may also be spread through the air, but this is much less likely. I should say spread through the air at a distance greater than 3 feet. This is considered aerosolized virus, and we think it may have a component, but we haven't really proven that for this new virus infection. There's also some concern that it's spread by other routes, such as through feces. But again, this is all considered to be minor right now compared to the major respiratory and contact route of spread.
Obviously, there's been a lot of concern about this when it was first identified out in Wuhan, but I think it grew substantially when it showed up in northern Italy, and now, as I said, we have a case in Brazil. Is it surprising that it's popping up in various places?
It doesn't surprise me. I think that it all started in Wuhan, but this virus spreads from person to person, so somebody may not even know that they were near somebody who came from Wuhan or who came from Wuhan 2 people ago. So given this kind of virus, it's not a big surprise that it's spreading.
The CDC yesterday said that we should be prepared for the real possibility. In fact, they said the certainty sooner or later that we'll have some communities exposed to this in the United States. What is the basis for them saying that? Is that your conclusion as well? We're going to have it here in some significant numbers?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to keep respiratory viruses out. I think people are trying to do the best they can at doing this by quarantining people, identifying people who are at high risk for having the virus. But this is, if you have a virus that's going to be contagious when people just start developing symptoms, it's very hard to know how to detect them and who you're going to screen. So it's just difficult. I think people are trying to do the best they can.
So what are the U.S. efforts as far as you understand them? Who's in charge? Is it CDC?
I think the CDC is. The Department of Human Health Services, of course, cares a lot about this as well, but I think the CDC is in the front line of this.
And what sorts of things should they be doing, are they doing? As far as you can tell, are they taking the steps that needs to be taken?
Well, what they're doing now is trying to make sure that people come into the country are free of the virus. That's about the best that you can do right now, I think. And then after that, if we start seeing cases here, you'll have to figure out management of quarantining and identifying people who are potentially contagious, making sure that large mass gatherings, and that could even include a school, doesn't become a place where virus can spread. This was illustrated on the cruise ships off of Japan, where putting everybody together for a period of time was a perfect setup for the virus spreading among people.
Well, we also think of things not just schools and public gatherings, but also things like factories and businesses. There are some reports here that businesses are shutting down and telling people to go home and work at home. For example, a Canary Wharf over in London that happened with yesterday. So is that something that we are prepared to do here in the United States?
I think that one can't say one's ever prepared to do it until it happens, and then you have to be prepared to do it. So I think people probably could and should be thinking about those kinds of scenarios, because this is the way the virus will spread when you have a large or numbers of people in close proximity, and one of them's infected, and you have a virus that spreads easily. That's the setup for infecting more people. It's just more practical. It's practical sense rather than anything that's medical.
As I said, I believe you've been studying coronaviruses of various sorts for almost 40 years now. Is there anything particularly out of the ordinary about this one? Does this one, so far at least, fit in with what you've seen before?
Yeah, so that's a good question because before 2003, we had cold coronaviruses, and those spread pretty similarly to this virus in the sense that people were they had a cold, and just like any other cold, it spreads easily, but no one really cared because it was an upper respiratory tract mostly, and cold spread. And then after that, when we had the SARS coronavirus and MERS coronavirus epidemics, that seemed to be viruses that were confined to the lower lungs. So they didn't care too much about the upper airways. The result was a bad virus. There's a lot of people got really sick with it, and 10% died in the case of SARS. But you weren't really contagious until you were sick. But this virus is a mix of the two. So it uses the same receptor for entry into cells as one of the upper airway viruses, and also that the SARS virus uses in the lower airway. So you have a situation where I think probably most people get an upper airway kind of infection, maybe a cold-like disease, maybe a little more than that, and then they'll be better. And then for other people, it goes into the base of their lungs, so they have more like the SARS kind of clinical disease that we saw 15 years ago. So it's a mix of both.
Okay, thank you so very much, Doctor. Really appreciate it. That was helpful. Dr. Stanley Perlman of the University of Iowa. And we'll bring you President Trump's news conference on the coronavirus. That's coming out at 6 p.m. Eastern Time today. Now we're going to turn back to the presidential race and where we stand going into the South Carolina primary, and for that matter, Super Tuesday next week. To give us the lay of the land, we welcome now Larry Sabato. He's director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. He comes to us today from Charlottesville, Virginia. So thank you so much for joining us, Larry. Where do we stand as far as we can tell? We now just had this endorsement from Jim Clyburn of Vice President Biden. Where do we stand going into Saturday?
Well, Clyburn's endorsement is big for Biden. They've been quietly promising this for a long time, and now it's happened, and at the right moment, just before Saturday's South Carolina primary, which is do or die for Joe Biden. He either wins that convincingly or his campaign is over. He can certainly stay in through as many primaries as he wants, but he's never going to be able to accumulate the delegates that he needs. However, this is his one narrow path to come back. If he does really well in South Carolina, and I think that means at least 4, 5, 6 points, if not more, against Bernie Sanders. Then he goes into Super Tuesday. That's 14 states on Tuesday, including a lot of southern states where you have large African-American populations, which is supposed to be Biden's strength. So he could be on the comeback trail if he does well Saturday. And Clyburn is key to his doing well on Saturday.
At this point, is there anyone who can really get more delegates than Bernie Sanders going into the convention of Milwaukee? I didn't say he'd necessarily have a majority of the delegates, but more delegates than he will get.
It's going to be tough. I wouldn't say it's impossible because we really just started the delegate allocations and we only have had 3 small states vote. So I'm not going to say it's impossible. I am going to say it's very difficult because everything I see, every poll and sounding from individual states indicates that while Bernie Sanders may only get 30 or 35% of a primary vote as opposed to a caucus where he does better, 30, 35% of a primary vote, and therefore maybe 35, 40% of the delegates, there may be 60 or 65% of the delegates for other people, but it's all divided up. So odds are he'll end up getting a plurality of delegates. He's not going to have a majority. And notice what he's been saying. If I have the plurality, I must be nominated. And everyone else says, oh, no, it's not going to be that way. We've always required a majority. And they're right. It has always been a majority. But, you know, they could be faced with a Hobson's choice. Either you give the nomination to Bernie Sanders and accept whatever's coming in November, or you take it away from him, consolidate the 60 or 65% that's not with him, and face a walkout by the Sanders delegates and voters come November.
Yeah, Larry, factor money into it, because Super Tuesday particularly requires a lot of money for a lot of those television and radio buys, as well as social media for that matter, to succeed. Who has the edge there?
Well, obviously, Bloomberg has a great deal of money. Steyer does too, but Steyer could do reasonably well in South Carolina. He's put a lot of time and effort into it, and a number of polls have had him in the mid or even upper teens. So he could be a factor there. I have a hard time seeing how he translates it to other states quickly. But Bloomberg could. Bloomberg has been everywhere all the time. His performance in the first debate and last night's debate, in my view, was mediocre to bad. But you see, all I saw were Bloomberg ads leading up to the debate, 2 hours. During the debate, he had ads. After the debate, he had ads. And so you add all that up and you realize, how much does his debate performance really matter? Maybe not all that much. Biden has almost no money, David. That's the problem for Biden. He has very little money.
I was going to ask just the question you posed. Of course, Michael Bloomberg is the founder and majority owner of our parent company. We want to remind people of that as we talk about him. But how much does the debate performance matter? I mean, I watched that debate last night. There was an awful lot of heat and light. I'm not sure exactly how much substance there was to it. But are people looking at that and deciding who they want to be the next president of the United States?
Well, they have been. I think the debates to this point have actually driven some of the ups and downs in the polls, and some of the candidates have really benefited from good debate performances. I didn't see anybody who had a good debate performance last night. How could you see anybody? They were interrupting one another. It was messy, nasty, unruly, out of control. Use whatever term you want. I thought it was a disaster of a debate for the Democratic Party and for the candidates, not just for the network.
And how much is it going to really give them a candidate that will prevail over Donald Trump come November? I also wonder about that because normally we talk about Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. We haven't even talked about them.
Yeah, well, the way things are going, we can expand that list quite a bit. Look, all the basic factors are moving in Trump's direction. But I also have to say, we know Donald Trump. And Donald Trump can disrupt those factors with some tweets or a rally or doing or saying all kinds of outrageous things at any moment. So this is less certain than it would be for a president who had a great economy and was, let's say, normal. Well, we don't have that situation. So I'm not going to shut anything down until we have to pull the curtain down.
As a student of politics, because you are a real student of politics, what do you make of the fact that we had Donald Trump, who really ran, if anything, against the Republican establishment, I think you can say, the party last time, and now we have a Bernie Sanders as the front runner, who certainly isn't embraced by the Democratic establishment this time. What do you make of that, the sort of almost breakdown or pushing aside the traditional structure of the parties?
Our institutions, not just our parties, our institutions, constitutional and otherwise, have been in decline for a long time. And it's caused many of us who study the process of democracy and how it works and how it doesn't work. It's caused us to be very, very concerned. And I think there's plenty of justification for worry. We're not just being worrywarts. We're going to have to see a reverse in this, and I don't know how it's going to happen without leadership. And we don't have that leadership right now, potentially in either party.
Okay, Larry, really helpful to have you with us as always. It's Larry Sabato. He's the director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia down in Charlottesville. Coming up, former Democratic governor of South Carolina, Jim Hodges, on what Democrats need to do in his state to challenge President Trump in November. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. South Carolina is the center of the universe for Democrats running for president, at least for the next 3 days. With the debate last night in Charleston, influential Congressman Clyburn endorsing former Vice President Biden earlier today, and of course, the big primary coming up on Saturday. Welcome now the only Democrat to win the South Carolina governorship in nearly 40 years. He's Jim Hodges. Governor Hodges now is a senior advisor at McGuire Woods Consulting and a partner at the McGuire Woods Law Firm. He joins us today on the telephone. So welcome, Governor. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, David.
So give us a sense, as a South Carolinian, as you watched that debate last night, how much of that was addressed to people from South Carolina and how much was really addressed over their heads to the people of the country overall?
Well, a little of both. I think a lot of it was dictated by the questions that were being asked. But, the history's been that South Carolina is the place where the winner of the Democratic primary here wins the race. So, a candidate who does well in South Carolina is more than likely to actually win the nomination. And I think, the discussions you heard that were appealing particularly to the African-American constituency here, which will be, roughly 60 to 65% of the primary vote, that is also a message to African-American voters in the Super Tuesday states and beyond. And I think one of the reasons we are so important is that the turnout here and the results here are a pretty good proxy for what is likely to happen down the road in other states.
So, as I said, Congressman Jim Clyburn from South Carolina endorsed Vice President Biden. Not a big surprise, but it happened today. It's generally thought that Vice President Biden is in a good position with the African-American voters, but more generally in South Carolina. How do you think he stacks up right now?
I think he does very well. I mean, South Carolina is a pretty moderate state, and Bernie Sanders did very poorly here 4 years ago. I don't see any evidence that he has expanded his base here. Frankly, I don't see much evidence that base has been expanded even in the earlier primary states. We don't have a lot of new voters showing up. He's basically been able to win with the same percentage he had before. So I think it's going to be a really good day for Joe Biden and for moderate candidates in general on Saturday.
At the same time, Senator Sanders has come on in South Carolina some, I think, according to the polling I've seen, at least from 538 and other places. What would account for whatever popularity he does have in South Carolina?
Well, the poll that came out today, I think, has him down 15 points, which is certainly a butt kicking in anybody's world. But I think that, what you're likely seeing with Senator Sanders is consolidating what base there is available to vote for him. And I don't think that's substantial here. The voters he appeals to aren't here in large numbers. And I will say that in the last week, I hear more and more from voters that they're concerned about picking the right candidate to beat Donald Trump. And that drumbeat has grown louder, and, discussions about things like the cost of Medicare for all, the disruption of private health insurance, and a range of other issues relating to Bernie Sanders, I think have hurt him here, and I think it will hurt him in other places as well.
One of the things that we heard from the former mayor, Pete Buttigieg, last night is voters need to be thinking as well about down ticket. That is to say, if Bernie Sanders is leading the ticket, Pete Buttigieg says that could really hurt some people down the ticket, some candidates for Congress and things like that. Is that a factor for people going in to vote in the primary this Saturday?
Absolutely, particularly in a state like ours where there aren't a lot of Democratic elected officials. We have a congressman in Charleston named Joe Cunningham who is one of those candidates that won unexpectedly in the last election. And for Joe Cunningham to be successful this time, having someone who is an asset rather than an anchor at the top of the ticket is very important. And those sort of conversations have been occurring on a much greater frequency since the Sanders success in Nevada. And David, I think it's important to remind everyone we've only had about 3% of the delegates chosen. I mean, Democrats are notorious for being hand-wringers over what might have happened in a few of the early primary states, but I don't view them as particularly reflective of the overall demographics of the Democratic Party, and have always said people need to wait until South Carolina votes to get a better sense of where the race might be.
And Governor, do you have any sense of the level of enthusiasm overall? I mean, we had something was a bit of a disappointment in the turnout for the caucuses in Iowa. It was a bit better in New Hampshire. Do you have any sense of what you're likely to get in voter turnout in South Carolina?
Yeah, it's hard to predict. I think there is interest and enthusiasm. I will say this. I think people have generally been satisfied with the group of candidates that are out there. There is no clamoring for new candidates to enter the race. They've been, pretty pleased with the group. I think it's, given the numbers of people here, it's just hard for people to whittle down their choices to, who they want to vote for. But there's incredible enthusiasm for November, and, an interest in casting a vote against Trump and putting somebody new in the White House. There's a lot of enthusiasm regarding that, and that's not going to change.
Okay, Governor, really appreciate it. That's former Democratic governor for South Carolina, Jim Hodges. And we're going to have more with the governor in our second hour. That's on Bloomberg Radio. Coming up here, amid all of the heated back and forth in last night's South Carolina debate, well, there were some lighter moments as well. We're going to take a look at some of those. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. There was no shortage of Democratic tension on the debate stage last night, but given at the end of the evening, actually, there was a lighter note when the candidates were asked to describe the biggest misperception people had about them.
Misconception, and you're hearing it here tonight, is that the ideas I'm talking about are radical. They're not.
That I don't eat very much. In fact, I eat all the time.
That I'm not passionate. I get that I'm kind of level. Some say unflappable. I don't think you want a president who's flappable.
That I'm 6 feet tall.
That somehow I'm defined by business success and money.
That I'm boring, because I'm not.
I have more hair than I think I do.
I'll leave it to you to judge whether they're misperceptions or not. Okay, stay tuned now for our second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. We're going to continue our conversation with former Democratic Governor of South Carolina, Jim Hodges. Plus, we're going to talk about the latest developments surrounding the coronavirus. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.